This is the case of People's Broadcasting Services versus the Secretary of Labor in relation to Article 128 of the Labor Code, which grants the Secretary of Labor or his duly authorized representatives the visitation and enforcement power. Private respondent John De Leon Duazan filed a complaint against petitioner with Department of Labor and Employment for illegal deduction, non-payment of service incentive leave, 13th-month pay, non-coverage of SSS, Pag-ibig, and PhilHealth, and others. After the summer investigation, Dole found that the private respondent is an employee of the petitioner and therefore entitled to his monetary claims. When the matter was brought to the Court of Appeals, it was also held that there is indeed an employer-employee relationship between the private respondent and the petitioner, and that the petitioner was accorded due process and the Dole Secretary has the jurisdiction over the case since Article 129 of the Labor Code has been repealed by RA 7730, which is an act further strengthening the visitorial and enforcement power of the Secretary of Labor and Employment. However, the Supreme Court reversed the decision of the Court of Appeals and held that there was no employer-employee relationship between the petitioner and the private respondent. Furthermore, the Supreme Court held in that decision that while the Dole Secretary may make the determination of the existence of an employer-employee relationship, this function could not be coextensive with the visitorial and enforcement power under 128B of the Labor Code as amended by RA 7730. The NLRC was then held as a primary agency to determine the existence of the employer-employee relationship. From this decision, the Public Attorney's Office filed a motion for clarification, seeking to clarify as to when the visitorial and enforcement power of the Dole Secretary be not considered coextensive with the power to determine the existence of the employer-employee relationship. So the main issue in this case is whether or not the Dole Secretary has the power to determine the existence of the employer-employee relationship in the exercise of the Dole Secretary's visitorial and enforcement power. The Supreme Court held that yes, the Dole Secretary or his duly authorized representative in the exercise of his visitorial or enforcement power has also the power to determine the existence of employer-employee relationship. If the complaint is brought before the Dole to give effect to the labor standards provisions in the Labor Code or other labor legislation, and there is a finding by the Dole that there is an existing employer-employee relationship, then the Dole Secretary exercises a valid jurisdiction to the exclusion of the NRRC. If the Dole finds that there is no employer-employee relationship, then the jurisdiction properly belongs to the NLRC. Nonetheless, in this specific case, the finding of Dole has been subjected to the review by the Supreme Court, and with the finding that there is no employer-employee relationship between the petitioner and the private respondent, the Dole has no jurisdiction over this specific case.